Dr. Kramer is a visiting assistant professor, new one, in the Department of Anthropology. Her previous appointment was at UCSD, and Dr. Kramer got her PhD from the University of Chicago. I also wanted to let you guys know that Dr. Kramer is teaching a new course on language and humor in the spring that we're all pretty excited about. So, without further ado.
And it's a $4.99, so grad students can take it. Yes.
Okay, oh, even better, so then good for grad. Everybody. Okay, great, yeah, I'll let you get started. Thanks. Oh, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kramer.
So the work I'm presenting today is part of a larger project looking at the semiotics of victimhood in American political discourse. And this project brings together a wide range of discursive data, including historical, contemporary, popular media, political documents, interviews with high-level staff at various political organizations, and participant observation conducted in both Washington, D.C. and a Bible Belt state that I pseudonymously call Columbiana. I look to these texts to explain what I think is an interesting phenomenon in American political discourse, which is that political arguments in the U.S., especially arguments about civil rights, frequently lapse into accusations of censorship. So, for example, during the debate on California's anti-gay marriage Proposition 8, pro-Prop 8 banner was damaged, presumably by the opposition, but as you can see, the supporters of Proposition 8 turn this into yet another argument in favor of Proposition 8, essentially saying, our opponents are censoring us, therefore they're wrong. More interestingly, these lapses into debates about censorship tend to be paradoxically symmetrical in that each side accuses the other side of silencing them. One conclusion we could come to is that lay people don't understand what censorship really means, that they're misapplying the term, that this paradoxical usage is merely proof that they don't understand it. But I think it's more productive to ask what kind of ideological framework these speakers are drawing on in which it makes sense for the concept of censorship to not only be ambiguous, but highly contentious and rhetorically powerful. And I argue that there's a set of ideologies about politics, language, and social life that implicitly connect arguments about censorship to arguments about power, such that these competing claims to being silenced actually represent competing models of power dynamics in American society. And today I'll be talking about a key component of that argument, a semiotic analysis of the concepts of voice and silence, not just the denotational meanings of the terms, in other words, what you would find if you looked them up in the dictionary, but their connotations and the constellations of concepts that they unite and tease apart as they circulate the discursive landscape. And I'll also be talking about the ideologies that undergird the significance of these concepts, focusing especially on language ideologies or beliefs about how language is, can be, and should be used by specific people in specific contexts. So, every April, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, or GLSEN, organizes the National Day of Silence, wherein students across the country take a vow of silence in order to illustrate the silencing effects of bullying and harassment on LGBT students and those perceived to be LGBT. The slogan of the National Day of Silence is, oddly enough, Stop the Silence, which raises the question, how is it possible to stop silence by being silent? An equally perplexing follow-up. 2 days before the 2012 Day of Silence, an Illinois Family Institute blogger referred to the event as the Day of Silencing, and warned that those who do not support a school day devoted to gay indoctrination are the ones who can expect to be silenced. And the Illinois Family Institute, along with a bunch of other religious conservative groups, counter-organized a Day of Silence walkout wherein parents keep their children home from school on the Day of Silence. So whereas for GLSEN, silence can stop silence, for these groups, silence can inflict silence. How is that possible? Clearly, these invocations of silence go beyond literal noiselessness into something metaphorical, and in fact, it's the resonances and dissonances between various literal and metaphorical meanings that make silence such a powerful rhetorical device, both as an object of discussion and as an embodied mode of communication or lack thereof. The power of the concept of silence is clear in the ubiquity of voice, sort of the flip side of silence, in contemporary political discourse. I kept encountering it throughout my research, in my interviews and in the mediascape that surrounded me, so here are a few examples. Here's an anti-human trafficking poster with the slogan, "Give victims a voice by using yours." Here is the World Wildlife Fund's website, which implores the reader to be the voice for those who have no voice. Here's an ad for Prematurity Awareness Day, which tells us to speak up for premature infants because they can't do it themselves. Here's a blog post on the Family Foundation's website advertising a pro-life event entitled "Speaking for the Voiceless." And similarly, a Family Research Council article about the movie October Baby, which is the protagonist of which is a survivor of a botched abortion, quotes the filmmaker saying, "I think it's time that the unborn have a voice, and I think that's what this movie gives them." And he encourages people to see the movie in order to say together, "We're tired of what Hollywood is force-feeding us, and we're tired of Hollywood not listening to our voice." The anthropologist Amy Schumann has already observed that the metaphor of voice, especially disparate voices, silenced voices, minority and marginalized voices, has become a familiar part of political discussions. And as these examples suggest, the metaphor of voice links literal speech to a constellation of other attributes and social positions. And in this presentation, I'll consider three main questions about this. First of all, what are some of the concepts that are implicitly caught up in the metaphorical meanings of voice? Secondly, what are some of the linguistic and political ideologies underlying those associations and their resonance? And third, what are some of the implications for political discourse and for the ways that Americans talk and think about freedom of speech? First, I'll start by looking at some of the ways that voice is used now and has been used historically. Now, the term was used very frequently by many of the political activists I interviewed, especially when they were talking in broad terms about the people they worked to benefit. So, for example, Patrick, the executive director of the Columbiana ACLU, when I asked him why his job was important, replied, "Protecting the rights of people who don't have a voice is crucial." And Daniel, an LGBT rights advocate, similarly said, "I rest on the notion that my job is a public service, particularly to give a voice to individuals who either don't have them or aren't being heard, even if they are using their voice, or are so downtrodden that they can't even focus on this fight." Now note that neither Daniel's nor Patrick's job focuses on the literally silenced. Daniel fundraises, lobbies, organizes volunteers, and does PR on behalf of LGBT rights. And although Patrick is at the ACLU, which is often thought of as one of the most stalwart protectors of freedom of speech, the Columbiana affiliate rarely deals with free speech issues. It's mostly, due to its location in the Bible Belt, spends most of his time on reproductive rights and church-state separation. Yet, their go-to descriptor for the people on whose behalf they work is those without a voice. What exactly do they mean? Marcus, who worked in the communications department at the NAACP, referred to the voices over and over again. When I asked him on whose behalf the NAACP worked, he replied, "Oh, we do women's rights, we do youth rights, we do minority rights, including African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans in particular. We do the LGBT community, and we do just kind of the underserved, like the impoverished community, which kind of encompasses everyone." Now, I asked Marcus what united all of these groups. What allows one organization, ostensibly created to help a particular racial group, to represent all of these groups? And he responded, "It's usually the people who have been underserved in the past and who haven't had a strong voice throughout the years. And we have shared interests in certain things and not in others, but when those things converge, we want to have a unified voice going forward to make sure that our voice is actually heard in that conversation." Then, a regional director for the Anti-Defamation League referred to the voiceless even more than Marcus did. So, tapping into my linguistic anthropological intuition, I decided to engage him in some meta-linguistic discussion. So I said, "You refer to giving a voice to people who may not have a strong voice, and I'm wondering what people you're referring to." And he said, "I think it runs the gamut. It could run the gamut to voices in Darfur, for example. We're on many coalitions in terms of figuring out ways to stop ethnic cleansing and genocide in Darfur. That's one grandiose notion of how we can give a voice to those that clearly Darfurians right now that are subject to the genocide do not have a very strong voice, especially females, and being on the front lines and figuring out ways to get the appropriate aid to change the governmental practices, etc., I think is giving a voice to those that may not have it." Now, I think this example throws the metaphorical nature of voice into really sharp relief, because clearly the main problem of genocide victims isn't that nobody's listening to them or that they're being censored. Their desires and interests, of which presumably not being killed is first and foremost, are apparent. So my conversation with Ben shows how far voice has come. In some cases, it's almost completely unmoored from the idea of speech. Now, how did it get this way? In order to answer this question, I searched the corpus of American historical English for the word voiceless, and I classified the resulting tokens as literal or metaphorical, which for my purposes, metaphorical, that literal metaphorical distinction means having to do with sound versus not having to do with sound. And I found a pattern in how the use of the term changed over time. So, in the first half of the 19th century, usage of voiceless was essentially entirely literal, referring to actual acoustic phenomena and human speech. So, silent in the sense of a voiceless prayer, inarticulable in the sense of voiceless melancholy, absent of human speaking, voiceless music, and then the linguistic term of art, right, meaning pronounced without the vibration of the vocal cords. In the second half of the 19th century, the usage of voiceless, a voice begins to stand in synecdochically for political representation more generally. So an 1849 article in the American Whig Review referred to corporations as voiceless in the halls of the state legislatures. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois writes in The Souls of Black Folk that half the South's laboring force is voiceless in the public councils and powerless in its own defense. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson writes, "It is of serious interest to the country that the people at large should have no lobby and be voiceless in these matters, while great bodies of astute men seek to create an artificial opinion and to overcome the interests of the public for their private profit." Now, these examples draw on the idea that in a representative democracy, elected officials speak for their constituents, thereby providing them with a voice. From the political representation trope, there's another metaphorical step to voicelessness, voiceless meaning powerlessness or lack of cultural representation more generally, and tokens from the 20th century tend to fall into this category. So, for example, a 1920 North American Review article describes a voiceless third who is defenseless and unable to keep pace with the ever-ascending spiral of wages and the cost of things which the struggle of the giants creates. A 1926 Harper's article refers to the vast, almost uncounted multitude of hardworking, voiceless, poverty-pinched men and women who sew caps, deliver ice, stitch pants, sometimes vote socialist, more often vote for Coolidge, peddle groceries, and empty ash cans. Now note that whereas in the previous examples, those who are voiceless in a particular context. So voiceless in the halls of the state legislatures, voiceless in the public councils. In these examples, voicelessness is treated as an enduring, non-contextual quality. So people are just voiceless, not voiceless in a particular context. And as we can see, there's still a connection to speech in the sense of not having an advocate to speak for them, but the term has come to mean a lot more. The essential plight of the voiceless is not that they can't speak, but that they lack some essential quality of human life, that they're in some sense powerless. Their literal silence is significant only in as much as it reverberates with a constellation of other characteristics that cohere in the metaphorical notion of voice. And this notion of voice is only compelling because it draws on a set of political and linguistic ideologies that frame language as the primary nexus for the enactment, promulgation, and disruption of societal power dynamics. So next, I'll consider some of these ideologies as I lay out some of the key dimensions of metaphorical voice. The most salient loss of voice, I think especially in the political context, is probably voice as self-interest. Through this lens, the voiceless are those whose needs are overlooked. Their rights are abrogated because they're unable to exert a self-interested force on the political zeitgeist, the way that the voiceful do. Note that this framework is very much rooted in principles of pluralist democracy, namely the idea that there's no common good, but rather competing goods that meld together or cancel each other out to yield some sort of average good. And the Self-interest resonances of voice are also linked to democracy more generally, because voicelessness is linked to a lack of democracy. So a 1955 article refers to Russia with its uncounted millions of voiceless people. In 2004, Carmen bin Laden, who's I think a sister-in-law of Osama bin Laden, in her memoir, Inside the Kingdom, My Life in Saudi Arabia, includes the line, "And were they to comply with Saudi society, I could not face the prospect that my daughters might grow up to become like the faceless, voiceless women I lived among." Now, it's not a coincidence that each of these examples cites a country that, at the time of writing, was particularly salient as the antithesis of the American ethos. And what made these societies so antithetical was precisely their lack of democracy. If part of having a voice is exerting self-interest, and a lack of democracy means there's no mechanism for lay citizens to do so, then the populace of these countries is voiceless by default. Turning to the language ideologies underlying this dimension of voice. Voice as political participation draws on a linguistic ideology in which language is the primary mechanism of democracy. So the entire set of political processes by which citizens self-govern is reduced to a model of face-to-face verbal exchange in the rational public sphere. And I think this Norman Rockwell painting, which is entitled Freedom of Speech, and was part of a series of 4 paintings he did called based on the 4 Freedom speech. So this painting, I think, represents this idea really well because it condenses the concepts of Americanness, democracy, speech, freedom of speech, right, into this single act, namely a working class man speaking his mind in a town hall meeting. So political voice relies on this ideology, but the idea of voicelessness also implicitly critiques it. Because while it holds up voice as a crucial part of citizenship, it suggests that it isn't innate and it's inconsistently distributed. In other words, the supposed rational public sphere is neither entirely rational nor entirely public. And we can also see this reflected in the Norman Rockwell painting, which celebrates class inclusiveness, but the public square is entirely white and almost entirely male. We've got one woman sort of peeking out over there. Right, so while it's celebrating this one element of inclusiveness, it's totally glossing over the other elements of exclusion. The second metaphorical dimension of voice that I'll consider here is voice as individuality. Now, through this lens, voice is an embodiment of what's unique and essential about a person. It reflects their particularity and therefore their humanity. And we can see this dimension of voice in the fact that voiceless is parallel to and often co-occurs with faceless and nameless. One's face and one's name are also thought of as unique identifiers of a person. So voicelessness in this context is a lack of individuation. A really good example of this comes from a 2010 U.S. Customs and Border Protection anti-human trafficking campaign. The campaign was called Don't Be Fooled, No Te Engañes, and the goal was to stop the trafficking of laborers and sex workers from Mexico and Central America. The tagline for the English language campaign that ran in the U.S. was Give Victims a Voice by Using Yours, and the tagline for the Spanish language campaign was You Could Be the Victim of Human Trafficking. Now, as you can see, the print ads deployed graphic photos of suffering. But the 2 television ads that the Customs and Border Protection put out deployed really richly layered allegories instead. Now, one of the ads, called Masquerade, I think really highlights the individuality dimensions of voice. So I will play that, and hopefully it will be loud enough.
Welcome, here all your dreams come true. Welcome, here all your dreams come true.
Te dije que nadie te lo viene practica.
Todavía no tenemos nada.
Welcome, here all your dreams come true. Welcome, here all your dreams. Empty your pockets. Empty your pockets.
Slavery still exists. Today it's called human trafficking. Give victims a voice by using yours. Your call is confidential.
The dream is over. Get to work.
Now, if we were to watch this ad with an entirely literal eye, the ending would be somewhat anticlimactic, I think, perhaps even absurd. After the creepily scored walk through the dimly lit tunnel with the sound of dripping and creepy music, you really expect an extremely horrifying ending, like something involving bone saws at the very least. But looking at the workroom, it's well lit, the workers aren't handcuffed, they're not being beaten or threatened by foremen. It might not be OSHA approved, but it does not look terrible. What makes the scenario dystopian are the masks covering the victims' faces. Now, I assume these masks aren't worn in real life by actual trafficked workers. Rather, they're a phantasmic embodiment of the experience of voiceless victimhood, collapsing the many acts of violence against victims of human trafficking into a single act of symbolic violence, the elimination of all traces of individual identity. The masks simultaneously oppress the workers and represent them as oppressed. Once again, there are links between the individuality dimensions of voice and the American ethos. Rugged individualism is one of the central values of democracy and thus Americanness, and de-individuation is undemocratic and un-American. In classic dystopian literature like 1984 and Brave New World, which obviously are not written by Americans but have become a seminal part of the American political canon, the key feature of the dystopias being presented is that social engineering has replaced diverse populations with armies of simulacra. So we can start to see here how the rhetorical power of voice is resting on layers of accreted meanings and associations, to which I will add one more. The final metaphorical dimension of voice I'll explore here is voice as self-expression. Now, through this lens, voice is an embodied process of self-actualization that inscribes change upon the individual. Voice is the ability to express your inner self, to turn the private and inarticulable into something public and articulated. And more specifically, it's the ability to express your emotions, your beliefs, and your identity. Now, all three of these things are considered highly personal and essential, and the process of making them public is thought of as an inviolable aspect of a fulfilling life. So depriving someone of the experience is depriving them of a fully lived life. The second anti-human trafficking ad, entitled Birdcage, highlights these self-expressive dimensions of voice.
Yo no salí de mi país para esto,
Say,
pero yo les pagué.
say. Let's see that pretty smile.
Slavery still exists. Today it's called human trafficking. Give victims a voice by using yours. Your call is confidential.
The little bird lost her wings.
Okay. So like the first ad, this one's also a highly metaphorical depiction of human trafficking. Literally speaking, women are rarely smuggled into the country to sit in giant bird cages and sing. And it's also clearly a metaphorical depiction of of voicelessness, since the victim's literal voice is precisely what's being elicited through coercion. This ad with a girl who's at once vocalizing and voiceless sheds light on what constitutes true self-expression in American culture, and on what's at stake when a person is denied access to that self-expression. Now, her utterances are not her voice because they're coerced, and coerced utterances lack the qualities that American language ideologies ascribe to the self-expressive voice, which is voluntary, stemming from the speaker's volition, ideally spontaneous, not scripted or planned ahead of time, It's very much a modern language ideology. This doesn't necessarily apply to American culture several hundred years ago. In some way true or accurately reflective of the speaker's inner state, and personal, not banal statements that are transparently true. So the self-expressive voice is intensely intimate, which is what makes the violation of it seem so abusive. It seems to breach the sacred bond between the voice and the self. And in some ways, the voice-self relationship is analogous to the one between self and sexuality, especially female sexuality, whose expression is also ideally voluntary, spontaneous, and highly personal. Thus, a girl being forced to sing is an effective allegory for forced prostitution. By the logic of the metaphorical voice, the violation of not only her personal autonomy, but the inner sanctum of herself is on the same spectrum as rape, if not actually akin to it. Now, I want to emphasize that the three dimensions of voice I've laid out here are neither exhaustive nor mutually exclusive. They not only coexist, but bolster each other, giving each other meaning. To draw on one dimension is to implicitly draw on the others because of the linguistic and political ideologies tying them together. And in turn, this set of aligned conceptual metaphors shapes the ways that language and voice are taken up in political discourse. So next I'll consider a few of the political implications of these ideological alignments. First, there's the question of how all this talk about voice relates to freedom of speech. What does talking about power in terms of voice do to American conceptions of freedom of speech? I think the alignment of metaphorical and literal silencing, and I'm using literal silencing to mean censorship here, is one of mutual influence. So the lamination of various forms of victimhood with silence imbues literal silencing with layers of meaning that go beyond merely suppressing speech. In other words, it implicates censorship in a web of dystopian power dynamics where one instance of censorship is never just one instance. And in a nation that prizes freedom of speech above all other rights, implicitly invoking censorship when talking about oppression adds rhetorical heft to one's argument. So equating unequal footing with de facto censorship means that any manifestation of power dynamics takes on the intense, focused sense of threat and outrage that accompanies censorship. And these effects are dialogic. These discourses simultaneously bolster the importance of freedom of speech and presuppose that importance and use it to dramatize other political issues. We can see too that the different metaphorical dimensions of voice I've laid out here parallel various rationales that have been given for why freedom of speech is important. The voice as self-interest paradigm aligns with both the marketplace of ideas rationale and the self-governance rationale, which posit that freedom of speech is important because an abundance of speech is what leads to either, in the case of the marketplace of ideas, attaining a higher plane of truth, or in the case of the self-governance rationale, a successfully run democracy. The voice as self-expression paradigm aligns with a more modern rationale for freedom of speech, the self-fulfillment rationale. And this rationale suggests that freedom of speech is important not because of its instrumental role in reaching some desirable goal, but rather that it's a good in and of itself. Self-expression is a human need in order to avoid stunting human development. Now note that conceptualizing speech as an intrinsic human need turns freedom of speech into a legal no-fly zone, where there's no justification for infringing on it, not even to preserve other rights. But if self-expression is a human need, one has to wonder what the parameters of true self-expression are, and that brings us to the second political implication of the metaphorical voice, the notion of recognition. Discourses of the voiceless analogize the very real constraints of face-to-face communication to the murky, abstract field of power dynamics. The communication literally requires a speaker and a hearer, thus having a political voice requires that others listen to and understand that voice. Sometimes the voiceless may actually be unable to speak in the case of fetuses and animals, but more often the perceived problem is a lack of uptake. The dilemma of the voiceless is that they can speak all they want, but nobody will listen to them. Analogizing power to speech, therefore, directs attention beyond the plight of the powerless and towards the responsibilities of those who do have power. It suggests that merely having a voice isn't enough. Others have a positive obligation to make a space for the expression of that voice and to listen to it. It's not enough to just to not actively interfere with its expression. Charles Taylor frames this sort of uptake in very stark terms when he describes the perspective that misrecognition shows not just a lack of due respect, it can inflict a grievous wound, saddling its victims with a crippling self-hatred. Due recognition is not just a courtesy we owe people, it's a vital human need. So Taylor suggests that it's a basic human need, a basic human right, not merely to be legally able to speak, but to actually speak and to have one's speech recognized. Now, this perspective suggests a radical reconfiguring of freedom of speech. Traditional First Amendment doctrine holds that harmful speech can always be countered with more speech, or as Brandeis famously wrote in his Whitney v. California decision, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. But if the goal of speech is not the emergence of a collective truth, but a process of individual fulfillment, the layering of speech upon speech is not a battle in the marketplace of ideas, it's an impenetrable cacophony in which nobody's voice can be heard. If not listening is silencing, it becomes possible to silence unintentionally out of ignorance and privilege, rather than just intentionally out of malice. In other words, the analogical relationship between voice and speech opens up the possibility of being silenced without being literally censored. But to figure out who is silencing whom, in this case, you need to know who has the ability to silence whom. Which brings me to the third implication for political discourse, which is that an invocation of voice implicitly reaches out beyond the micro-politics of the individual interaction and brings in an entire macro-political framework of societal power dynamics. These competing claims about who is silencing whom, then, aren't disagreements about the facts of the particular case, but disagreements about far more fundamental issues, namely whose speech and silence are powerful and whose speech and silence are powerless. So voice as a kelp for victimhood is linked to a set of context-specific anxieties about who has power, who lacks it, and who has the responsibility to speak up. Let's take a look at some quantitative data that supports this claim. Now, as part of my corpus search, as I mentioned, I sorted voiceless tokens by whether their use was literal or metaphorical, and I looked at how the use of each changed over time. Now, here is a graph of the number of metaphorical tokens of voiceless per million words over time. Now, note that there are peaks at three different historical moments, the 1840s to the 1860s, the 1920s, and the 1960s to 1970s. These were all periods of rapid, progressive social change. The abolition of slavery, first wave feminism, and the civil rights movement and second wave feminism. In other words, these were periods when questions of who had power over whom became both vitally important and extremely fraught. So there's a connection between voice and these anxieties. Voice gives people a concrete way to argue about power without explicitly talking about it. And we can also see an upswing in this past decade, accompanying a burgeoning debate over immigrants' rights and a dramatic strengthening of the LGBT rights movement, which brings us back to the scenario I described at the beginning of the talk. We can now see that when Glisson refers to the silencing effect of bullying, they don't mean that bullies are literally forbidding LGBT teens from speaking. Rather, they're arguing that a climate of threat towards LGBT teens prevents those teens from expressing their identity. They have silenced participants dramatize this metaphorical silence by embodying literal silence. Analogizing their oppression to censorship frames the threat in ways that seem more urgent and widely applicable. Meanwhile, religious conservative organizations that fight the day of silence don't believe that the mere act of refusing to speak can literally prevent others from speaking. Rather, they're arguing that the school's unabashed embrace of the gay agenda creates a hostile climate in which students are afraid or ashamed to express their sincere religious beliefs. Thus, religious students are deprived of the same right to self-expression that gay students are attempting to harness. Both organizations are ultimately fighting a sense of alienation among their constituents, of which the suppression of self-expression has become emblematic, of which the silencing of voices has become emblematic. What they disagree on is the matter of what constitutes mainstream culture and discourse, and who is consequently left out of the metaphorical and literal conversation. To make a claim about voicelessness is to implicitly take a stance about the power dynamics in American society. But, at the same time, framing the issue in linguistic terms obscures the claim's political nature. So, what can we take away from all of this? First, the conceptual metaphor of voice aligns tropes of power, agency, identity, and speech, which enables speakers to discuss all of these things at once, transforming highly abstract and fraught issues into seemingly self-evident and concrete topics. But in some ways it also forces people to discuss all of these things at once. For example, you can't discuss power without also implicitly bringing along language, democracy, Americanness, individuality, etc. on some level. Second, because actors are always self-reflexively reacting to their own position in the socio-political landscape, perceived power dynamics are just as crucial an object of study as actual power dynamics. And so that's one of the topics that I've researched, is the ways that people conceive of themselves as members of groups that have power or don't have power, and how that shapes their behavior. And finally, because of the ways that American language ideologies put language at the front and center of political life, the study of language, and especially of language ideologies, is essential to the study of American politics. Political discourse is densely polysemous, and untangling these webs of signification is necessary if we're to make any sense of it all. Thank you.
This was wonderful. I loved every aspect of it. But I was really, I wanted to hear more about the uptake aspect. How much voice itself is constituted through the idea that there's this receptor and who the receptor is. So that that's, I get the sense that that's kind of what makes voice different from just any other kind of articulation. Is that there's some certain person or body or entity that is imagined to be taking it up, doing something with it.
Right, and people are much less specific about that, right? Who, voiceless, who, for whom, right? Is it us? Are we the ones not listening to them? But most of the people who are talking about the voiceless are saying that they're speaking on behalf of the voiceless, which is another thing, another aspect of this analogizing power to language, right? That we have this idea that texts can be dislocated and passed along. And so you can speak on behalf of someone, you can exercise a voice on behalf of someone. You can't really, power doesn't work in the same way, right? If my congressman speaks on my behalf, then I have a voice. If they exercise power on my behalf, it's not clear that I have power, right? So it changes the ways that we think of it. But yeah, I mean, the issue of uptake, it's kind of always implicitly there, but it's never explicitly brought up, except occasionally in discussions of privilege, in the sense that, why am I speaking on behalf of these people? Because I have the privilege that enables me, that means people will listen to me. People more generally, yeah.
Thank you, that was great. So my question is a little bit of just about the kinds of historical trajectories that you were tracking, and I'm wondering to what extent you are noticing or theorizing the trajectory of mass mediation and anxieties around mass mediation and the kinds of shifts in voice that you've seen, and if there's a way in which particular anxieties, and I think it gets a little bit to maybe what Chris was pointing to about the hearer and what it means to be heard, what it looks like or feels like to be heard. If shifts in mass mediation are shaping the space of possibility that voice opens up.
I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right that that's a crucial element of this transformation, right? That representation, the meaning of representation, right? It's able to take on these non-political meanings because it's no longer about representatives in the Senate, right? That we're talking about representations in circulating popular media. And that, in fact, when people are talking about voice these days, that's probably what they are talking about, right? Who's being presented in the popular media, whose opinions, whose experiences. So yeah, I will definitely think about that.
It's very striking to me how much the discourses around the voice and the freedom of speech and self-expression are implicitly with the kind of underlying assumption of in English, because this is not a metaphor that shows up in any of the discussions about language endangerment or revitalization or like language rights other than English. So I'm actually struck by the fact that this is not something that shows up in those discourses when when those elements you were talking about of individuality and expression and stuff are those elements are with it, but it's not a metaphor that is used at all in those either legal or kind of generally circulating discussions. So I'm imagining that part of it is because of the underlying assumption of freedom of speech in English, and in fact learning English is the strategy for gaining a voice, right? Or getting someone to speak for you in English, as those commercials suggest, right? Are what giving a voice means in some ways. Like speaking for them in English is a way of providing a voice for someone else.
Right. There's the, in Spanish, don't get human trafficked, right? Versus English, if you see someone being human trafficked, please call. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, that it's more likely to come up in issues of like standardization, and that this idea that learning the standard language, whatever that may be, is a way to gain a voice. I was actually just looking at this woman who she's actually, I think she's a drama professor, but she like has this program in inner city schools in Pittsburgh, I want to say, where she teaches kids how to speak standard American English, mostly African American kids how to speak standard American English. And the program, it's called like Your True Voice. The idea that your true voice, and she's on the one hand she's there, oh, there's nothing wrong with speaking AE. You just need to be able to tell the different, use it in different contexts, know appropriateness, and know this standard American English also. But then she goes ahead and calls that your true voice is the standard American one, which I find interesting, especially in light of normal discourse of authenticity that I'm used to, where your true voice, right, is the one that's, for non-white people is marked, right?
But I think that's the being heard element of it, right? That
That
the aspect of voice of being heard, it has to be in English or in standard.
Jenny's question made me think. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say the uptake thing again.
Jenny's question made me think of an expression that was going through my head while you were at the end of your talk, which is in El Salvador, the circulation of Monsignor Romero's voice, who was murdered in 1980. They would call him La Voz de los Sin Voz, or the voice of those without a voice. And it was sort of about this priest who spoke for the people who didn't have voices, or the archbishop. And he would have, in fact, a radio program that circulated all around the country denouncing the military and human rights abuses. And then he was murdered, and so it became even more kind of resonant. His voice was silenced, and yet his voice would not be silenced. But the point of all of that was that there's an incredible, obviously, metaphor and a voice in there, but it's in a completely different historical context, certainly with some similar influences. But I just wondered if you, this is very much rooted in U.S. history and U.S. context, and I wondered first if you have a comparative, if you've looked at other people's work, comparative work in other, just simply even other similar kinds of European language countries, and then or outside of that.
I haven't found anyone else really talking about this topic, but one of the reasons I like presenting this work is because then I get to hear from other people saying either, oh yeah, there's a similar thing in this language in this place where I work, or, this is totally absent in the culture where I work. So yeah, I kind of rely on
It was definitely a political claim in El Salvador at the time. There's a war, right? But
Yeah.
people are being murdered, and so therefore they need a voice. But it also is a very powerful person from the Catholic Church, the Archbishop, who can speak for the poor. It would be interesting to study. Anyway, I hadn't thought about it.
Okay. I really appreciated this, and one thing that I was thinking about throughout this was how do the Voiceless talk about being voiceless, or how do they perform that? And one thing that I was thinking about is a phenomenon that's happening with this election of the interruption of Black Lives Matter or immigrant groups going to Iowa or other kind of explicitly political speeches and interrupting, and it's worked. It really has worked. The interruptions and the speaking and the discourse has worked. So I just thought it'd be kind of an interesting component.
Yeah, that's something that sort of comes up elsewhere in this project. This question of, and it ties into this in the sense of one's perception of who is silencing whom in that case, right? It very much depends on who you think has power, and then that once again depends on what level of social scale you are looking at, right? So there was a lot of this is something that happened a lot in the late 60s in colleges, right? The students would protest speakers and shout down speakers and prevent them from coming, and prevent them from speaking. And that was sort of the major panic about censorship in the 1960s. Now it's all about political correctness, but back in the 1960s it was about college, which would probably be called political correctness these days, but it was not called political correctness at the time. But yes, this question of whether shouting someone down is a form of, is part of the marketplace of ideas, right? Where the group of people who all have a shared goal can overwhelm the single speaker who's disagreed with, or whether that constitutes an act of censorship. And different people see it in different ways depending on whether they think these students are representing a hegemonic majority or sort of brave minority.
I wonder, just quickly following on that, if the ideology could be flipped upside down so that somebody might think of violently victimizing another person as a mode of speech, and you might be able to link that to these white male school shooters who seem to feel like they're being silenced and don't have any other recourse but to actually commit violence.
Right, it's part of the whole equivalence of power and speech and victimhood, that they can sort of be translated into one another. And that the idea that you'd have a voice after death, right? If you have a spectacular kind of death. That's interesting.
It also made me think of the way in which the powerful too can use silence as a weapon. Thinking of the way in which the Catholic Church has been completely silent about the sexual abuse of children for so long, and used the power to be silent, as an oppressive force. But also, I wanted to ask you if you'd say a bit more about it's interesting, it's not just language ideologies, but the way in which language ideologies seem to layer or map on top of lots of other ideologies. And it occurs to me that just as somebody said, the free market, that the whole ideology of the mass-mediated discourses as somehow being ultra-democratic, right? Because every TV program has its own. You can do a Twitter feed, and the news tells you can feed in. Let's all join the conversation as if it's a free market, right? But like the free market, right, it doesn't lead to any kind of really democratic sharing of a discourse, in any real sense. There's still the power of the producers to select, whose Twitter is going to,
Right.
be heard.
Right, but
I mean,
people
so
still,
it's
yeah.
layering the political ideology around the economic ideology around the free market onto the language ideology.
Right, and then where that falls short, right, people draw on the self-expressive dimensions, right? So, yeah, maybe no one will ever read my Twitter feed, but the fact that I'm writing it, right, means something to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in the Twitter raises this question too. I'm interested in writing, and these metaphors of voice circulate in writing a lot, and a lot of the metaphors track with your analysis here in terms of self-expression and individuality and things. It displaces it completely from speaking, as Twitter sort of does perhaps too, because it's not really speaking. But the other thing I'm thinking too is that a lot of these also displace it from individuals. That there's a sense that voice is also a social voice. That figures of personhood are signaled and indexed through taking on, an educated voice, or the voice of medicine, or this voice or that voice. So it's more of a phenomena that functions where you're aligning yourself with a social register that gives you a particular figure of personhood within a social interaction. And I wonder if, in thinking about the politics of it, how much of the voice is solely the individual voice, and how much of the voice is a group of people unable to project figures of personhood into discourse.
I think it's very much a group phenomenon, that it's when you talk about the voiceless, it's always a mass. These sort of voiceless masses of people. And part of that is the depersonalization, right? The idea that if someone is recognized as an individual, then they kind of have a voice, right? So the voiceless are by default in groups. I think it's more akin to a sort of a perspective or a point of view, right? We can go the Bakhtinian route and say that's a particular way of speaking, but I think in lay usage it's more seen as just a perspective, a point of view, a particular social category of people with a presumed united set of preferences and needs and desires.
Yeah, so actually that question was very close to the one I was going to ask, so I feel a little silenced by it, but it had to do with the individuated aspect of voice and the fact that the voiceless in the examples you gave, and a lot of them is really a plural noun. I guess I wanted to draw you out a little bit more on that, to think about the extent to which the ideal of the individual, right? This guy standing up in a meeting and speaking for himself is certainly at the core of certain ideals of democracy, a certain myth of democracy. But it's also a profoundly limiting aspect of political power, right? If you think about moves against unions or social movements or other kinds of pluralized expressions of political agency. And so, just thinking about the way in which this metaphor of voice moves across those levels of scale, silently in some ways. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Other than the fact that it makes it really difficult to write about. That it's this, it's sort of a cloud concept, right? There's no one set definition of it. It's something that's always including some attributes and excluding others, and that there is this tension between individuality but recognition, which requires sociality, right? Requires social connection, requires other people. And so there's tension there, incompatibility there, but that's never stopped anyone. So yeah, it's something I sort of think about in an inchoate way that's difficult to put into words.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if it comes back to uptake as well, in the sense that meaningful voice through language implies some intersubjective faith or commitment to uptake, right, to solidarity in any speech act.
So because language rights was mentioned earlier, I'm going to very clumsily stumble through this because I don't use this language that everyone's been using today. But the Bloc Québécois in Quebec frequently uses the term voice when they're talking about vote for us, right? So they, in the last election, I think it was probably, well not this last, but the previous provincial election, it was probably doing voix plus fort, was their big thing, speak in a very loud voice, right? Vote for us, speak in a very loud voice. But this is the same party that has done two really important things that deliberately tried to silence non-separatist Quebecers. And the very first thing, was more specifically very like non-Quebecois French, period, allophones of any kind. The very first thing is that they tried to have themselves declared as a distinct society, which because of how Quebec was settled, there are no treaty agreements for Canadian natives there. So being called and recognized that federally would mean that then native lands would be made available to Quebecers in a way that had not been, there'd be no fiduciary responsibility on behalf of the federal government to those people anymore. And so that would have been like, that's something where they literally were silencing a very small percentage of the population, let alone any number of other people that are being silenced in the same, by the same means. And then the second thing that they did in this last provincial election, not last provincial, but the 2012, because they had a minority government, there's been a lot of turmoil, they're getting voted in and out all the time, but they had a majority for about a year where they tried to pass the Quebec Statute of Values, which limited religious wear by public servants. So if you were a public servant, you couldn't wear anything that was overtly religious unless, and you can look at their posters for this because it's really fascinating if you haven't seen them, unless it was representative of the Catholic Church. And it had to be then under a very particular size. And the argument that they made was that by people wearing these non-small, first it had to be small, secondly, non-Catholic or non-Christian representations, that they were infringing on everyone else's rights and liberties by their own religious expression, and therefore we speak in one voice, we speak as Quebec. And this was the kind of language that was being generated at the time, but these were very, very, very discriminatory. And that's all I really had to say about that. While you were talking about this, and I was watching all of these things that you were saying, this is the one thing that came to my mind, is that this is an enormous problem for people who are non-French, non-Quebecois French in the province of Quebec at any time.
And it would be, and I didn't know that was going on in Quebec, and that would be interesting. If I spoke French, it'd be interesting to compare that to the discourses in France about the same phenomenon of banning religious apparel, right? And I'm pretty sure they don't have the exception for crosses.
Yeah.
But yeah, whether it very much ties into not necessarily the voice thing, but this idea of, who is oppressing whom in this situation, right? Are these 8-year-old Muslim girls who want to wear their headscarves to school representing a dangerous Islamic threat, right?
Right.
Or are they just 8-year-old girls who want to wear headscarves and like the French government is saying you can't do that, right? Who is doing the oppressing here? And it really depends, and depending on what scale you look at it, right? Are you looking at it at the level of the school, where obviously the teachers, the administrators have power over the students, or are you looking at it at a national level, where then perhaps the French would debate this, right? Where the white French people have power over minority immigrant French people, or at some perceived world scale where the Western secular tradition is seen as being under threat from this Islamic fundamentalist program.
Right. The issue in Quebec is perhaps just slightly different. And I'm also Anglican, I should come out as Anglo-Canadian, and specifically from a region that borders Quebec very tightly. So my perspective on this, and I have no sociocultural training, so my perspective on this is admittedly highly biased. But the way that these ads read from the Anglo my Anglo perspective anyway, is very much one of self-describing as being a minority when they are in fact the majority in the province. One of also the expression of like frustration and voicelessness when in fact they often have the majority in provincial elections. They've also had the minority house in the House of Commons at times. It's a really, really strange thing that it's self-describing as something that they're not in the interest of suppressing something that they're not, which is really, to me, as a, a simple biological anthropologist.
Yeah, and I think, the election season, which is, the elections are still a year away, oh my God, but, right, and then it's just, it's kind of everywhere in the US, this phenomenon of people claiming to be victims who, to me, clearly do not seem to be victims. From their perspective, I'm just as crazy to say that this other group, you're not victims. Well, of course we're victims. And part of it is that people are looking at it at different scales. And part of it is just a disagreement about, different perceptions of who has power, right? Is it, have feminists won, and are they have they taken over and now men are the endangered gender, or is it the other way around? Right?
Is it ever the powerful knowing that they're powerful using a rhetoric that they know is powerful to maintain power? How do you? Is it always this? You seem. I feel like you're giving. And I'm really cynical, but I feel like you're giving. Everyone kind of an equal, fair shot at, or assuming that they're genuinely perceiving the things that they're expressing.
Right. I think that. One of my goals in this project is to be kind of agnostic about the whole thing, right? To say, I'm looking at perceived power dynamics, regardless of whether they reflect actual power dynamics, because I think there are lots of people doing really good work on that, right? And so, I don't, right, examples where this doesn't happen, where people say, yeah, I have power, and for a good reason, right? There is a paradox there where sometimes the same argument can either support or undermine someone's authority. So saying, I have authority because, look, all of these people agree with me. Right? I have authority because, gay rights is, gay marriage is good because, look, 70% of Americans support gay marriage. Or, right, you can say, look, me, as a religious Christian who opposes gay marriage, I have authority here because I'm part of this oppressed minority, right? I'm part of this minority that, I'm an iconoclast, right? The value of the iconoclast, which has particular value in the US. The idea that you're the only person, right? Somehow the fact that 1 out of 1,000 scientists is saying that climate change is not a human activity, right? Isn't the result of human action. For some people, that's more evidence that that person is right. It's well, if they're it must be a conspiracy on everyone else's part. But for other people, for maybe not most people, for a lot of people, it's the consensus, right? The power is in the numbers. Tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the minority, both are problems.
I was just very interested in this talk for this campus because I was thinking about the fact that in the discussion of Salida, which was literal, so you were saying that you were interpreting literal voicelessness as censorship. So here, that was represented in the protest as a literal covering of the mouth. So all of the images are of either individuals covering their mouth or covering the mouth of the statues, the alma mater or whatever. So censorship there was the metaphorical silencing and the covering of the, I mean, so there was definitely a
Yeah.
linking there where that discussion was going on here about what type, how censorship and having a voice or being silenced fit into, like, at what level.
Right,
that was
and it's
going on.
complex, especially complex in that situation because it was an instance of him saying something, right? So yeah, I'll have to look into that. I didn't know about those.
Plenty of data,
protests.
yeah.
Oh yeah. John.
One thing that interests me throughout the old images and video clips and the presentation was that any kind of voiceless is materialized as a kind of form of faceless. So I would just wonder, in your archaeological work of Voiceless, there was a kind of clear kind of discursive connection between the kind of voiceless and other kind of faceless or other kinds of expressive like ideologies.
I think, it wasn't something I looked specifically for, but it was something that popped up occasionally. So I think the example that I gave of Carmen bin Laden's memoir, where she wrote, that my daughters would become part of the voiceless, faceless movement, where, once again, there's a polysemy there of faceless meaning lacking individuality, but also meaning a literal veiling of the face, right? And they're both, so I think voiceless and faceless tend to are very similar in a lot of ways. But one uses a kind of visual modality and the other one uses an auditory modality, and verbal modality.
The more this conversation goes, the more I'm thinking about just the richness of this whole metaphor. But I'm going back to something, and maybe more than one of the examples that you had at the start of the talk, and that has to do with the connection of the metaphor of voice to a different kind of metaphor for political process, which is conversation. Which seems to me more so than voice to be an absolute euphemism for thinking about for thinking about political process and dialogue. I think about this campus where chancellor after chancellor embarks on a listening tour as part of their stuff. But I'm wondering whether your project extends more broadly to think about the way political engagement or debate even is figured as a kind of conversation, and how the metaphor of voice connects with that and enables that.
I think that the kind of the reliance on this sort of outdated idea of politics that's happening in these where in small town America it kind of still does happen that way. In face-to-face meetings, discussions, I guess places like Iowa still kind of cling to in their caucuses, right? It represents a kind of nostalgia. A nostalgia for some indeterminate time in the past that's imagined as this truly American, right? Which you cannot separate from elements of, you can't separate it from race, you can't separate it from gender, right? This nostalgia is also, the time that people are nostalgic for is a time when exclusion was considerably worse than it is now. One of the things that I've looked at are the ways that these debates about silencing are implicitly drawing on historical discourses about racial equality, about gender equality, focusing mostly on the ways that that second wave feminism is always present somewhere in these debates, right? It's this sort of ghost haunting all of these debates in the form of political correctness, in the form of this specter of political correctness, that it's this inherently sort of feminized and feministized quality. But also these, looking at the trajectories that people imagine, the temporal trajectories people imagine for things, things going downhill versus things going uphill, or things getting better or things getting worse. What was the origin point? And different people set that origin point to different places, and some of them set it at sort of the founding of the country, right? Like this, sort of what I call the standard average forefather kind of perspective that encompasses, the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln, despite the fact that he was 100 years later, right? All of this kind of real America, right? Real American history, what we think of as which a lot of people think of as the heyday of American culture.
I think this, I just don't pick up, oh, I'm sorry, did I just cut something? But I think there's also, when Andy says the conversation, it makes me think of The Conversation, the film, right? And that there's also a kind of nostalgia for a moment in which there was a state that listened, and it was okay that the state listened. And at some point, the paranoia about and the anxiety around who might be listening, and that being a problem, right? A site of actually the undoing of sociality rather than the space of its constitution seems to be important, and it aligns around the same time that exactly the kinds of phenomena you're talking about and the rise of the kind of, anxiety about the second wave and the enemy within. And I mean, I think it's not coincidental that we can't generate a sense of who the hearer might be at the same time when we're in a political system in which the state itself is understood to be the enemy, right? So there was a time in which at least politics in a kind of folk way was oriented towards a set of institutions that we could trust. And that was a relationship of voicing, but also of hearing, right, of speaking and hearing. And at some point, the kind of paranoia around who might be listening and who might be listening in ways that were dangerous, right? And I think there are interesting Cold War echoes there as well about the point at which, we're speaking and somebody's hearing, but it's not a somebody we can trust. Maybe not, but
I guess for me, I don't know how much of that sense that the government has become less attentive. Like, I don't know whether this is a nostalgia for a time that didn't exist, right? Whether it's sort of always been the case that people say, oh, now the government is being intrusive. Back, 30 years ago, they actually listened. But it certainly is, at the very least, a folk understanding of how it works, of how the government is operating.
You mentioned the kind of double-edged sword of any articulation, so I was thinking of the critiques from within communities of the very organizations who are operating to give voice, and it's often the presumption of speaking for others, right? And so that is the major critique of something like the Human Rights Campaign or any of those, right? That they're speaking for a very particular group to a very particular audience, and that it doesn't actually represent the people who they're speaking instead of, right? So I think a lot of the critical discourses are using the same metaphors or understanding things to be the same, right? So
strategic essentialization.
Yeah. Or what gives this group the right to speak to be the voice of all of these other people, right? In like the perceptions of power.
And where discussions of intersectionality come up as well, right? So, were second wave feminists speaking for women? Were they speaking for white women? Were they speaking for middle class women? Right? That those. Something I don't really talk about here, but that is the fact that when people are talking about voice, they're so frequently talking about speaking on behalf of people without a voice, right? When they talk about the voiceless, they're either explicitly saying or implicitly stating that they are the ones speaking on behalf of the voiceless. that that's part of what, that they are, by describing the voiceless, in fact doing that. And that question of whether it's always going to be people speaking on behalf of the voiceless, or whether the voiceless actually can speak on their own behalf. Then they stop being voiceless, I suppose. It's a paradoxical category.
But it seems like there are a bunch of institutions or organizations that exist to be the voice for X, right? Like all of those organizations exist to be the voice of whoever, or for whoever, right?
And when I ask them, who do you work on behalf of, they all say, I work on behalf of the voiceless, right? They don't say, I work on behalf of LGBT individuals, right? Or I work on behalf of African Americans. They say, I work for the voiceless, right? Which I think, on the one hand, points to this, the increasing, I don't want to say burden, because that sounds negative, but the increasing pressures of intersectionality, right? That the people who work in these organizations are hyper aware of the fact that they need to seem intersectional at the very least. But also that it's a politically powerful way, it's a rhetorically powerful way of describing the people you're working for. So instead of saying, I'm working for this group, people with this attribute, saying I'm working for the voiceless, presupposes that what you're doing is valuable, right? That what you're doing is charitable and righteous. Yeah.
Is it something that appears in a lot of NGO literature, do you know, globally? Because that seems like a...
I don't know, I'll have to look into that.
Rich country. Rich country.
Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful.